A Negro Explorer at the North Pole by Matthew A. Henson, with a foreword by Robert E. Peary, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired. Copyright 1912. Foreword. Friends of Arctic exploration and discovery with whom I have come in contact, and many whom I only know by letter, have been greatly interested in the fact of a colored man being an effective member of a serious Arctic expedition, and going north not once, but numerous times during a period of over 20 years, in a way that showed that he not only could and did endure all the stress of Arctic conditions and work, but that he evidently found pleasure in the work. The example and experience of Matthew Henson, who has been a member of each and of all my Arctic expeditions since 1891. My trip in 1886 was taken before I knew Henson, is only another one of the multiplying illustrations of the fact that race, or color, or bringing up, or environment count nothing against a determined heart if it is backed and aided by intelligence. Henson proved his fitness by long and thorough apprenticeship, and his participation in the final victory which planted the Stars and Stripes at the North Pole and won for this country the international prize of nearly 4 centuries is a distinct credit and feather in the cap of his race, as I wired Charles W. Anderson, Collector of Internal Revenue and Chairman of the dinner which was given to Henson in New York in October 1909 on the occasion of the presentation to him of a gold watch and chain by his admirers. I congratulate you and your race upon Matthew Henson. He has driven home to the world your great adaptability and the fiber of which you are made. He has added to the moral stature of every intelligent man among you. His is the hard-earned reward of tried loyalty, persistence, and endurance. He should be an everlasting example to your young men that these qualities will win whatever object they are directed at. He deserves every attention you can show him. I regret that it is impossible for me to be present at your dinner. My compliments to your assembled guests. It would be superfluous to enlarge on Henson in this introduction. His work in the North has already spoken for itself and for him. His book will speak for itself and him. Yet two of the interesting points which present themselves in connection with his work may be noted. Henson, son of the tropics, has proven through years his ability to stand tropical, temperate, and the fiercest stress of frigid climate and exposure, while on the other hand, it is well known that the inhabitants of the highest north, tough and hardy as they are to the rigors of their own climate, succumb very quickly to the vagaries of even a temperate climate. The question presents itself at once. Is it a difference in physical fiber, or in brain and willpower, or is the difference in the climatic conditions themselves? Again, it is an interesting fact that in the final conquest of the quote, prize of the centuries, not alone individuals, but races were represented. On that bitter, brilliant day in April 1909, when the Stars and Stripes floated at the North Pole, Caucasian, Ethiopian, and Mongolian stood side by side at the apex of the earth, in the harmonious companionship resulting from hard work, exposure, danger, and a common object. R. E. Peary, Washington, December 1911. Introduction. One of the first questions which Commander Peary was asked when he returned home from his long, patient, and finally successful struggle to reach the pole was how it came about that, besides the 4 Eskimos, Matt Henson, a Negro, was the only man to whom was accorded the honor of accompanying him on the final dash to the goal. The question was suggested, no doubt, by the thought that it was but natural that the positions of greatest responsibility and honor on such an expedition would, as a matter of course, fall to the white men of the party rather than to a Negro. To this question, however, Commander Peary replied in substance, Quote, Matthew A. Henson, my Negro assistant, has been with me in one capacity or another since my second trip to Nicaragua in 1887. I have taken him on each and all of my expeditions except the first, and also without exception on each of my farthest sledge trips. This position I have given him primarily because of his adaptability and fitness for the work, and secondly on account of his loyalty. He is a better dog driver and can handle a sledge better than any man living, except some of the best Eskimo hunters themselves. End quote. In short, Matthew Henson, next to Commander Peary, held and still holds the place of honor in the history of the expedition that finally located the position of the pole, because he was the best man for the place. During 23 years of faithful service, he made himself indispensable. From the position of a servant, he rose to that of companion and assistant in one of the most dangerous and difficult tasks that was ever undertaken by men. In extremity, when both the danger and the difficulty were greatest, the commander wanted by his side the man upon whose skill and loyalty he could put the most absolute dependence, and when that man turned out to be black instead of white, the commander was not only willing to accept the service, but was at the same time generous enough to acknowledge it. There never seems to have been any doubt in Commander Peary's mind about Henson's part and place in the expedition. Matt Henson, who was born in Charles County, Maryland, August 8, 1866, began life as a cabin boy on an ocean steamship, and before he met Commander Peary, had already made a voyage to China. He was 18 years old when he made the acquaintance of Commander Peary, which gave him his chance. During the 23 years in which he was the companion of the explorer, he not only had time and opportunity to perfect himself in his knowledge of the books, but he acquired good practical knowledge of everything that was a necessary part of the daily life in the ice-bound wilderness of polar exploration. He was at times a blacksmith, a carpenter, and a cook. He was thoroughly acquainted with the life, customs, and language of the Eskimos. He himself built the sledges with which the journey to the pole was successfully completed. He could not merely drive a dog team or skin a musk ox with the skill of a native, but he was something of a navigator as well. In this way, Mr. Henson made himself not only the most trusted, but the most useful member of the expedition. I am reminded in this connection that Matthew Henson is not the first colored man who by his fidelity and devotion has made himself the trusty companion of the men who have explored and opened up the western continent. Even in the days when the Negro had little or no opportunity to show his ability as a leader, he proved himself at least a splendid follower, and there are few great adventures in which the American white man has engaged where he has not been accompanied by a colored man. Nearly all the early Spanish explorers were accompanied by Negroes. It is said that the first ship built in America was constructed by the slaves of Vasquez de Ayllon, who attempted to establish a Spanish settlement where Jamestown, Virginia, was later founded. Balboa had 30 Negroes with him, and they assisted him in constructing the first ship on the Pacific coast. 300 slaves were brought to this country by Cortez, the conqueror of Mexico, and it is said that the town of Santiago del Principe was founded by Negro slaves who later rebelled against their Spanish masters. Of the story of those earlier Negro explorers we have, aside from the Negro Estevan or Little Steve, who was the guide and leader in the search for the fabulous Seven Cities, there is almost nothing more than a passing reference in the accounts which have come down to us. Now, a race which has come up from slavery, which is just now for the first time learning to build for itself homes, churches, schools, which is learning for the first time to start banks, organize insurance companies, erect manufacturing plants, establish hospitals, a race which is doing all the fundamental things for the first time, which has, in short, its history before it instead of behind. Such a race in such condition needs for its own encouragement, as well as to justify the hopes of its friends, the records of the members of the race who have been a part of any great and historic achievement. For this reason, as well as for others, for the sake of my race as well as the truth of history, I am proud and glad to welcome this account of his adventure from a man who has not only honored the race of which he is a member, but has proven again that courage, fidelity, and ability are honored and rewarded under a black skin as well as under a white. Booker T. Washington, Principal, Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. A Negro Explorer at the North Pole. Chapter 1. The Early Years. Schoolboy, cabin boy, seaman, and Lieutenant Peary's body servant. First trips to the Arctic. When the news of the discovery of the North Pole by Commander Peary was first sent to the world, a distinguished citizen of New York City, well versed in the affairs of the Peary Arctic Club, made the statement that he was sure that Matt Henson had been with Commander Peary on the day of the discovery. There were not many people who knew who Henson was, or the reason why the gentleman had made the remark, and when asked why he was so certain, he explained that for the best part of the 20 years of Commander Peary's Arctic work, his faithful and often only companion was Matthew Alexander Henson. Today, there is a more general knowledge of Commander Peary, his work, and his success, and a vague understanding of the fact that Commander Peary's sole companion from the realm of civilization when he stood at the North Pole was Matthew A. Henson, a colored man. To satisfy the demand of perfectly natural curiosity, I have undertaken to write a brief autobiography, giving particularly an account of my Arctic work. I was born in Charles County, Maryland, August 8, 1866. The place of my birth was on the Potomac River, about 44 miles below Washington, D.C. Slavery days were over forever when I was born. Besides, my parents were both free-born before me, and in my mother's veins ran some white blood. At an early age, my parents were induced to leave the country and remove to Washington, D.C. My mother died when I was 7 years old. I was taken in charge by my uncle, who sent me to the school, the quote, N Street School, in Washington, D.C., which I attended for over 6 years. After leaving school, I went to Baltimore, Maryland, where I shipped as cabin boy on board a vessel bound for China. After my first voyage, I became an able-bodied seaman, and for 4 years followed the sea in that capacity, sailing to China, Japan, Manila, North Africa, Spain, France, and through the Black Sea to southern Russia. It was while I was in Washington, D.C. in 1888 that I first attracted the attention of Commander Peary, who at that time was a civil engineer in the United States Navy with the rank of lieutenant. And it was with the instinct of my race that I recognized in him the qualities that made me willing to engage myself in his service. I accompanied him as his body servant to Nicaragua. I was his messenger at the League Island Navy Yard, and from the beginning of his second expedition to the Arctic regions in 1891, I have been a member of every expedition of his, in the capacity of assistant, a term that covers a multiple of duties, abilities, and responsibilities. The narrative that follows is a record of the last and successful expedition of the Peary Arctic Club, which had as its attainment the discovery of the North Pole, and is compiled from notes made by me at different times during the course of the expedition. I did endeavor to keep a diary or journal of daily events during my last trip, and did not find it difficult aboard the ship while sailing north, or when in winter quarters at Cape Sheridan, but I found it impossible to make daily entries while in the field, on account of the constant necessity of concentrating my attention on the real business of the expedition. Entries were made daily of the records of temperature and the estimates of distance traveled, and when solar observations were made, the results were always carefully noted. There were opportunities to complete the brief entries on several occasions while out on the ice, notably the 6 days enforced delay at the Big Lead 84 degrees north, the 12 hours preceding the return of Captain Bartlett at 87 degrees 47 minutes north, and the 33 hours at North Pole while Commander Peary was determining to a certainty his position. During the return from the Pole to Cape Columbia, we were so urged by the knowledge of the supreme necessity of speed that the thought of recording the events of that part of the journey did not occur to me so forcibly as to compel me to pay heed to it, and that story was written aboard the ship while waiting for favorable conditions to sail toward home lands. It was in June 1891 that I started on my first trip to the Arctic regions as a member of what was known as the North Greenland Expedition. Mrs. Peary accompanied her husband, and among the members of the expedition were Dr. Frederick A. Cook of Brooklyn, New York, Mr. Langland Gibson of Flushing, New York, and Mr. Eyvind Astrup of Christiania, Norway, who had the honor of being the companion of Commander Peary in the first crossing of North Greenland, and of having an Eskimo at Cape York become so fond of him that he named his son for him. It was on this voyage that Peary's leg was broken. Mr. John M. Verhoff, a stalwart young Kentuckian, was also an enthusiastic member of the party. When the expedition was ready to sail home the following summer, he lost his life by falling in a crevice in a glacier. His body was never recovered. On the first and the last of Peary's expeditions, success was marred by tragedy. On the last expedition, Professor Ross G. Marvin of Cornell University lost his life by being drowned in the Arctic Ocean on his return from his farthest north, a farther north than had ever been made by any other explorers except the members of the last expedition. Both Verhoff and Marvin were good friends of mine, and I respect and venerate their memories. Naturally, the impressions formed on my first visit to the land of ice and snow were the most lasting, but in the coming years I was to learn more and more that such a life was no picnic, and to realize what primitive life meant. I was to live with a people who, the scientist stated, represented the earliest form of human life, living in what is known as the Stone Age, and I was to revert to that stage of life by leaps and bounds, and to emerge from it by the same sudden means. Many and many a time, for periods covering more than 12 months, I have been to all intents an Eskimo, with Eskimos for companions, speaking their language, dressing in the same kind of clothes, living in the same kind of dens, eating the same food, enjoying their pleasures, and frequently sharing their griefs. I have come to love these people. I know every man, woman, and child in their tribe. They are my friends, and they regard me as theirs. After the first return to civilization, I was to come back to the savage, ice and rock-bound country 7 times more. It was in June 1893 that I again sailed north with Commander Peary and his party on board the Falcon, a larger ship than the Kite, the one we sailed north in on the previous expedition, and with a much larger equipment, including several burros from Colorado, which were intended for ice cap work, but which did not make good, making better dog food instead. Indeed, the dogs made life a burden for the poor brutes from the very start. Mrs. Peary was again a member of the expedition, as well as another woman, Mrs. Cross, who acted as Mrs. Peary's maid and nurse. It was on this trip that I adopted the orphan Eskimo boy Kutlukukto, his mother having died just previous to our arrival at the Red Cliffs. After this boy was washed and scrubbed by me, his long hair cut short, and his greasy, dirty clothes of skins and furs burned, a new suit made of odds and ends collected from different wardrobes on the ship made him a presentable young American. I was proud of him, and he of me. He learned to speak English and slept underneath my bunk. This expedition was larger in numbers than the previous one, but the results, owing to the impossible weather conditions, were by no means successful, and the following season all of the expedition returned to the United States except Commander Peary, Hugh J. Lee, and myself. When the expedition returned, there were two who went back, who had not come north with us. Miss Mary Peary, aged about 10 months, who first saw the light of day at Anniversary Lodge on the 12th of the previous September, was taken by her mother to her kinfolks in the South. Mrs. Peary also took a young Eskimo girl, well known among us as Miss Bill, along with her, and kept her for nearly a year, when she gladly permitted her to return to Greenland and her own people. Miss Bill is now grown up, and has been married 3 times and widowed, not by death, but by desertion. She is known as a holy terror. I do not know the reason why, but I have my suspicions. The memory of the winter of 1894 and 1895 and the summer following will never leave me. The events of the journey to 87 degrees 6 minutes in 1906 and the discovery of the North Pole in 1909 are indelibly impressed on my mind, but the recollections of the long race with death across the 450 miles of the ice cap of North Greenland in 1895 with Commander Peary and Hugh Lee are still the most vivid. For weeks and weeks, across the seemingly never-ending waste of the ice cap of North Greenland, I marched with Peary and Lee from Independence Bay and the land beyond back to Anniversary Lodge. We started on April 1st, 1895, with 3 sledges and 37 dogs, with the object of determining to a certainty the northeastern terminus of Greenland. We reached the northern land beyond the ice cap, but the condition of the country did not allow much exploration, and after killing a few musk oxen, we started on June 1st to make our return. We had 1 sledge and 9 dogs. We reached Anniversary Lodge on June 25th with 1 dog. The grim destroyer had been our constant companion, and it was months before I fully recovered from the effects of that struggle. When I left for home and God's country the following September on board the good old Kite, it was with the strongest resolution to never again, no more, forever, leave my happy home in warmer lands. Nevertheless, the following summer I was again northward bound with Commander Peary to help him secure and bring to New York the 3 big meteorites that he and Lee had discovered during the winter of 1894 and 1895. The meteorites known as the Woman and the Dog were secured with comparative ease, and the work of getting the large 70-ton meteor known as the Tent into such a position as to ensure our securing it the following summer was done. So it was not strange that the following summer I was again in Greenland, but the meteorite was not brought away that season. It is well known that the chief characteristic of Commander Peary is persistency, which, coupled with fortitude, is the secret of his success. The next summer, 1897, he was again at the island after his prize, and he got it this time and brought it safely to New York, where it now reposes in the American Museum of Natural History. As usual, I was a member of the party, and my back still aches when I think of the hard work I did to help load that monster aboard the Hope. It was during this voyage that Commander Peary announced his determination to discover the North Pole, and the following years, from 1898 to 1902, were spent in the Arctic. In 1900, the American record of farthest north, held by Lockwood and Brainerd, was equaled and exceeded, their cairn visited, and their records removed. On April 21st, 1902, a new American record of 84 degrees 17 minutes was made by Commander Peary, further progress north being frustrated by a lack of provisions and by a lane of open water more than a mile wide. This lead or lane of open water I have since become more familiarly acquainted with. We have called it many names, but it is popularly known as the Big Lead. Going north, meeting it can be depended on. It is situated just a few miles north of the 84th parallel and is believed to mark the continental shelf of the land masses in the northern hemisphere. During the 4 years from 1898 to 1902, which were continuously spent in the regions about North Greenland, we had every experience, except death, that had ever fallen to the lot of the explorers who had preceded us, and more than once we looked death squarely in the face. Besides, we had many experiences that earlier explorers did not meet. In January 1899, Commander Peary froze his feet so badly that all but one of his toes fell off. After the return home in 1902, it was 3 years before Commander Peary made another attack on the pole, but during those years he was not resting. He was preparing to launch his final and, sincerely to be hoped, successful expedition, and in July 1905, in the newly built ship Roosevelt, we were again poleward bound. The following September, the Roosevelt reached Cape Sheridan, latitude 82 degrees 27 minutes north, under her own steam, a record unequaled by any other vessel, sail or steam. Early the next year, the negotiation of the Arctic Ocean was commenced, not as oceans usually are negotiated, but as this ocean must be done by men, sledges, and dogs. The field party consisted of 26 men, 20 sledges, and 130 dogs. That was an open winter and an early spring. Very desirable conditions in some parts of the world, but very undesirable to us on the northern coast of Greenland. The ice pack began disintegrating much too early that year to suit, but we pushed on, and had it not been for furious storms enforcing delays and losses of many precious days, the pole would have been reached. As it was, Commander Peary and his party got to 87 degrees 6 minutes north, thereby breaking all records, and in spite of incredible hardships, hunger, and cold, returned safely with all of the expedition, and on Christmas Eve, the Roosevelt, after a most trying voyage, entered New York Harbor, somewhat battered but still seaworthy. Despite the fact that it was to be his last attempt, Commander Peary no sooner reached home than he announced his intention to return, this time to be the last, and this time to win. However, a year intervened, and it was not until July 6th, 1908, with the Godspeed and good wishes of President Roosevelt, that the good ship named in his honor set sail again. The narrative of that voyage and the story of the discovery of the North Pole follow. The ages of the wild, misgiving mystery of the North Pole are over. Today and forever it stands under the folds of Old Glory.